Welcome to Untaught Essentials. I'm Jeremy Hunter. This is our first episode for 2022, and it will be of interest to anyone who manages an organization, cares about the quality of organizational culture, and especially how to adapt in the post-pandemic world. Our guest is a pioneer in exploring how people and organizations change and grow. Richard Boyatzis is, among other things, a distinguished professor at Case Western Reserve University's Weatherhead School of Management, and a pioneer in emotional intelligence research and its application to work. And most recently, he is co-author with Melvin Smith and Ellen Van Oosten of the excellent book, Helping People Change. We talk about the vital elements organizations need to thrive in today's circumstances, and why these elements are often overlooked or disregarded. So why don't people change?
I'm doing a theoretical paper right now, building to what I see as my last, hopefully great book on intentional change theory, but it's all on the distributions of change. And I think most of the time, human behavior, nevertheless human change, is not modeled by what we would call Gaussian or normal distributions, where you have that typical bell curve. It's really patterned, if you plotted it, with a power curve, or what's called a Taylor series. The reason is that I think human beings are inherently survival based, that we are physiologically driven, regardless of our philosophical stand, but we're physiologically driven at unconscious speeds of processing in our body to protect us as an organism. At the same time, ever since we sat around campfires before we had written language, we also want to be interacting with others. So there is a basic need to belong. I think both of those factors leads to what I would call very conservative behavior, that on the whole, people prefer to stay with what they have. It's a homeostatic process rather than venture out. And when people do venture out, they have a lot of difficulty. And as you know, the expression regression to the mean, I mean, people, whether individually or in teams or organizations or communities or countries, will tend to gravitate towards a safer position, a more secure position. And leaders who abuse people's need to feel secure very often can capture their hearts and minds for the wrong reasons. So what I think happens is people don't really pursue the effort. And it's very stressful. I mean, learning and change is stressful. And if what happens is that's the major neurological, hormonal, behavioral system that you're engaging, you will close down. I mean, we know that's what the sympathetic nervous system does. It narrows our perceptual field from 180 to about 30 degrees. It puts us into a defensive hunkering position. Today, with social media blasting us all the time, we're under even more threat. And then we add on top of all of this, acute stressors of, a pandemic and the political and social and economic disruptions. So all of it means, the last 2 years has been hard, of course, on all the families of people who have lost loved ones, but it's actually affected the most people in terms of their mental health. And we're not going to get over that for a number of years. I mean, not to go clinical on you, but, I think most people, whatever underlying neuroses or fears they had before the pandemic, have kind of amped them up because of, in part, the social isolation. Anyway, all this says that I think there are regressive forces all around us. And even, I remember doing this when I was working with alcoholics. If they wanted to stay sober, which they had to, I knew if that was their main target, that they would be back drinking within 6 months because they needed some purpose bigger than that. Why? Because, you take somebody who's been socially, if not abusively drinking for 20, 30 years, and their families have made modicums of adjustments, if not throwing them out. If they've kept a job, it's been borderline. Usually they bounce around. And all of a sudden they stay sober, and they make it to their 6 month coin in AA, and they go back into their families and their jobs. And part of what they're hoping to do is to say, hey, I'm back. And everybody else says, oh, yeah, right. We don't believe that at all. So the interpersonal processes that are a part of all of our lives, all the different kind of um, convergent social systems that we're a part of, from nuclear families to social identity groups to others, all converge to try to keep us doing the same. It's enabling. Now that works well if the group is encouraging growth, like
Healthy, right?
study
Yeah.
groups in graduate schools or book clubs or things like that, or AA. But it also works the other way if they're gangs or organizations that want consistency, which often translates to conformity, and that means stay the same. So I think there is a lot of homeostatic pressure on us to not change. And that the people who do change, as we know from the literature, most behavior change at the individual level has about a 3 week to 3 month life. We know even knowledge acquisition from MBA courses of a top 20 ranked MBA program, the retention of knowledge from the introductory required accounting course, the half-life of it was 6.5 weeks.
Wow.
So that what
Perishable
happens is,
skill.
oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And when we get to the harder ones, I mean, the hard skills are the interpersonal ones. Learning finance is what I call a soft skill. So when you get to the hard skills, how to make eye contact, how to be a nice person, how to care for somebody, how to understand and be patient enough to help motivate somebody to explore, to learn, to innovate. I think that's what's really lost. And I think the engagement numbers today worldwide show evidence to that. I mean, pre-COVID, 76% in the United States, of 83 in Europe, 81 in Japan, of people with full-time jobs pre-COVID were not engaged in their work. That's a motivation crisis writ large.
Right.
Now it's even worse because of the isolation. A lot of people are saying, do I really want to do this? And, every organization I've been talking to in the last 6 months in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 countries is talking about the fact that retention is a major thing on their mind. And it's not just, some of these include some of the top healthcare institutions and most innovative companies in industry and all that. So I think all of that conspires. So the question is, how do you motivate something like that? Well, in the past, people used to think, give people feedback, show them where they're screwing up. And then, of course, they'll want to bounce back. And in fact, I was one of those people. I mean, I did one of the first studies that said setting specific goals to compensate for your weaknesses helps you change. 40 years later, 35 years later, after I did that study, I realized that I was off. Although I believed the research that we got, I didn't really understand what the attribution was to the driving force. Now, with 39 longitudinal behavioral change studies through the Coaching Research Lab, 3 fMRI studies, 2 hormonal studies, we actually understand the internal psychophysiological mechanism around individuals changing in ways that hold our data. Some of our data goes out 5 to 7 years. And what we're finding so far, there may be other things, but right now there are 2 things that really help to ignite and sustain the efforts. One is a dream, a sense of your personal vision. The question we often ask is, if your life were fantastic 10 to 15 years from now, what would it be like? And, work might be part of that, but we're looking for the big picture. And we want people to dream, not goals. We don't want people to forecast. We want them literally to break with reality. Sometimes if people feel stuck or they've been living in a repressive political regime or country, or they've been in a particularly stultifying organization where fear and dissonance is the typical leadership style, sometimes we have to use what I call the more playful version of that to warm them up to get into that, which is you just won $80 million after tax in the lottery. How does your work or life change? Um, but it seems very clear that neurologically, hormonally, and then the psychological process of affect allows you to be open to new ideas, to another person. And when that happens, your peripheral vision expands. You're looking at more in the environment. You'll consider the environment, not just narrow things.
Mm.
And it turns out that a lot of things that we have to do every day, like solve problems and analyze things financially, suppress that. That, Tony Jack's work on the opposing neural domains shows that that kind of analytic activity, which is useful and necessary for us to figure out what we want to have for dinner, but it suppresses this other that he calls the empathic, technically the default mode network, that allows you to be open. So the vision or the dream does this by helping you create a big picture, a deep sense of purpose. I think for most of us, a noble purpose. And in the process, it stimulates hope.
Mm.
And hope is one of those really powerful emotions that can not just give you a sense of movement, but help you keep going. Because inevitably, when you engage in a change process or learning, you're going to have a lot of these ups and downs. And it is the context, we now contend, for your change that has to be revitalizing. Unfortunately, specific goals are useful later in the process, but they enable you to focus, which you need to do to get something done. But if you start with that too early, you'll miss literally the excitement and joy of life. You'll miss the curiosity. That's one factor. The second one is what we call a resonant or caring relationship, whether it's with a particular coach or physician or parent or manager or friend or spouse or partner. It doesn't matter, but it's having what we find is more than just one or two of these resonant, caring relationships that stimulate a deep sense of gratitude and compassion. So all of a sudden, you can step outside of yourself. I mean, in the last chapter of our recent book, Ellen and Melvin and I took society to task and said, narcissism is rampant. And it's not just in North America, it's everywhere. I've been in 6 countries in the last 4 months, and everywhere, South America, Europe, narcissism is nuts. And, my example is, when did the selfie become the most popular form of photography? So,
Mm.
what's the antidote to narcissism? Caring about someone else. Caring about someone else. So, like I said, there may be other things, but what we've been able to discover so far is these two experiences help people get really excited about learning, change. Spending time on feedback does not, it causes stress. Setting specific goals does not at the beginning, it causes specific stress. So a lot of the things that we think help people do the opposite. And we know this not just because of the research we do in the coaching research lab at Weatherhead, but also we train coaches. We've been training coaches. I mean, unofficially, I was training coaches since 1990, but we have a whole unit that does it for the past 20 years and a pool of coaches that can offer services to the outside world. But The trick is, well, not the trick, but the approach is that they are trained to use this approach to helping people, not the typical ways that people are certified by many agencies, or as managers, you're taught to, kind of focus on the bottom line, which makes everybody feel like an instrument.
So
So,
let's back
sorry,
up. I
you
mean,
probably wanted something less than an hour oration on that.
and if it's okay, do you have a little extra time past
Yeah.
12:30? Yeah, because there's a bunch of stuff that we could go really deep on. Let's go back to something you said earlier. Economics tells us that men are rational actors looking to maximize their own material self-interest.
Which is absurd. Sorry, the premise is absurd.
The premise is absurd, right?
Yes.
What you're suggesting is that, in fact, we are looking to, I don't know if maximize is the right word, but we prioritize safety. And
yes. But let's go back to your premise, Jeremy. The economists made the mistake, which, I lay the blame on Rene Descartes. I mean, he gave this thinking thing way too much credit, because what we're talking about is not just rational thought, but it's conscious rational thought. And as it turns out, our brain is operating in thousandths of a second with integrated networks of ideas and feelings. So we are sentient beings. And when you start with the premise that we're sentient beings, then you say, okay, from a feeling level, what are some of the things people look for? One of them is safety and security.
Yeah. And I mean, that one insight, I mean, that's an interesting similarity between in our work, because I start with safety, right? And if you are in a state of threat or a state of shutdown, you're not going to be, at your best, shall we say, right? And so how do you organize systems for people not to be stressed out all the time, right? I heard your number, 81% of Japanese are actively disengaged before the pandemic. And as you know, I do a lot of work in Japan. And it's also one of the most overstressed societies in the world.
Right. So you've got both extremes.
Yep. And so you start to see people shut down, organizations don't innovate, you don't grow, right? So that really caught my attention. And thinking as a manager, right, how do I create, and now psychological safety has become kind of a buzzword,
right,
for good or for ill. But how do you create an organizational system where people feel safe to explore?
Well, right. Let's unbundle psychological safety a little bit, because it's a good phrase, and it's the research is very sound. But it may conflate a number of things that, if you break them up, help us to understand what to do. One of them is trust is a part of it. One of them is caring. I mean, in our last book, Melvin L. and I talked about coaching with compassion versus coaching for compliance. But Melvin and I have been doing this since 2003, using the Confucian interpretation of compassion. So it's not the Western or even Buddhist of caring for someone in pain. It's the benevolence that's a part of Confucian philosophy, Taoism, if you will, that allows you to open up and care for others, those in pain and those who want to grow. That's a key part of psychological safety. Feeling that you're safe in the sense of you can trust the people around you, they can trust you. And then you have the sense of belonging, which scientists will say is different than psychological safety, but I'm not so sure in our experiences we sort that out that clearly. And all of that has another part of safety, which is very central to the work you've been doing for years on mindfulness. Your sense of centeredness.
Yeah, interesting. So, and thinking about organizations that even healthy ones that want to change, right? And they know, okay, the way this is operating, too stressful. There's too much, what I would say, too much red zone in their lives, right? And
Right.
how would you go about that?
Well, there are a number of things that I've already talked about that you could start as a regular practice. One is every manager, leader, executive should start every meeting, project meeting or staff meeting or annual meeting, with some either stories or discussion of purpose, not goals, not how well did we do, because that's confusing measures with purpose. Start it with purpose so people can step back and say, wow, I'm a part of something important. And that's hard because most executives get beaten over the head so much around budgets that they immediately share that angst. Well, that's not what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be helping interrupt it. So part of it's think about purpose, think about values, and then you can get into the other. Part of it is to pay attention to people's sense of who they're working with. I am a nerd, and I'm the kind of person who answers emails and then I have to go back and put the person's name and say, oh, how are you doing? All that stuff afterwards, because it's not my tendency. And one of my colleagues who is one of my coaches is Ellen Van Osten, who's director of our coaching research lab, and Ellen.
You're a
And
lucky guy.
For years, Ellen would start meetings by saying, let's spend some time checking in. And there's a part of me, the old CEO who says, oh God, we're wasting time. Here's more overhead, this and that. Well, the fact is that she's always been right on this. I don't know about everything, but mostly. But on this, and I watched her do this masterfully during COVID.
Mm.
And although we used to do it before at meetings she was in charge of, watching her do it during COVID just made my kind of jaw drop at how people shared ideas and got stuff done at lightning speed once they felt reconnected. So it's not wasting time. It's reminding people of our interpersonal atmosphere.
Taking
Of
care
our
of the
relationships.
relationship first. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Right.
Well, it's like that thing about 4 years ago that started about people saying, let's go to a 3-day work week. Let's eliminate lunch, eliminate coffee breaks, all that stuff. It was the stupidest thing I've ever seen because, and actually Dan Goldman and I and a couple doctoral students, Udayan Dar and John Osiri, published a study that came out last March talking about the things that enable us to thrive or flourish versus survive. And we had a series of research studies. And a lot of the things at work that enable you to interrupt all of the hormonal flow that keeps you locked in this defensive stress mode happen during a coffee break, happen with a short walk outside, where Dively is. I mean, taking 10 minutes or 15 minutes to walk outside, go to one of the Starbucks, or sometimes I used to send my EMBA classes over to the botanical garden to do the exercise while they're walking around the gardens, just to change the natural environment. Lunch. I mean, the research now is clear that we have to have more shorter moments of renewal throughout a day to function well, to be more engaged, to be less depressed, to be more resilient. And that movement to try to eliminate all those things took it all away. I was just giving a speech in Madrid 2 weeks ago, and after the big speech, 600 people, there was a lunch with about 100 executives, and one of them asked me a question. I said, well, here's an example. When I first joined the faculty of ESADE in Barcelona in 2000, we would always have 2-hour lunches, and I would choose it in the faculty dining room, and a group of us would sit, and they always had a bottle of red wine and a bottle of white wine on the table. Some people drank, but a lot didn't. But we always had 2 hours for lunch. Now they've moved and they've grown and all this kind of stuff. They have a big cafeteria so everybody can see each other. Well, now people spend between 20 and 30 minutes at lunch. And some people even take their lunch to their offices. And I've talked to a lot of managers and executives and professionals throughout Spain, and they have literally, in Americanizing, as they often call it, their lunch, they haven't increased their effectiveness. They've destroyed one of the features of Spanish society that allowed people to be more effective.
And thus you see rising rates of depression and anxiety because all that
Yes.
connection time is removed. And now, so that's like the next question would be, COVID and work from home is kind of eliminated the water cooler as even a physical place we go to, right? And so how would you, if you are how do you build those moments in a work from home kind of digital environment?
It starts with the realization that social media isn't all that social. Like Facebook friends really aren't friends.
Yeah.
And that although because of COVID and other things, we're doing more of these things through computers, but nonetheless, to do them with live streaming video is more important than just audio. And it's better than just the phone because you have more channels of interacting. Um, I've been organizing certain webinars, and even though some of them have 600 or 2,000 people on them, the ones that I'm organizing, I'm trying to keep to less than 49 so that everybody can be seen on the screen, because I think it helps. And when I'm talking to a group, I'll give my talk, but then when we open up for the Q&A, I ask them to go live video and ask their questions. So I think one of the issues is look for opportunities. I almost said excuses, but opportunities to see each other. And if we don't have them with physical presence, then allow for the fact that you probably need more frequent, interactive online. It's not the same. It's like when I say to people, don't email or text the person who's down the hall. Go say something to them, knock on their door. Well, now that people aren't there. So I think that's important. There was a big movement in organizations for a while that said, oh, well, let's have more team experiences and outward bound things. And well, I've never been big on that stuff. I figure if I want to go in nature on the beach or in the woods, I'd rather be with my wife and my dogs than a whole bunch of other people. But I do think finding other ways to just chat. And what's very important is the frequency rather than the length of time. So that's something that people need to just get a little more adjusted to.
Like
I think
a 5-minute
it's
check-in or
just
something.
Yes. Yes.
Right. Frequency, not length is what.
And allow ourselves to have some parts of conversations, if not an entire conversation, that doesn't have an agenda.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like I was just reading an article a couple of days ago about that's finally showing the concrete evidence that we schedule our kids so much that they're losing the ability to be creative and to fantasize. So all of a sudden they grow up and they turn around and say, well, what am I supposed to do next? And say, it's
right. And so they can't generate something in their own mind.
So I think we have to, I'm not saying that, look, we have to have tasks, we have to have goals, we have to get stuff done. But if that's the mode all the time, then we're losing part of the emergent, the organic, what one of our faculty, Don Wolf, the late Don Wolf, used to say, the kind of organizational behavior time, the human process time, which is a little more organic. Um,
So it's, it's also a similar theme that I've also been working with, which is the idea of redefining the notion of productivity in
right.
the in the environment of the quote unquote knowledge worker. And it's the idea that knowledge workers aren't just knowledge workers, we're also quote unquote social workers too, right? And that it's not just the stuff in our head, but it's in the relationship we have with one another. And that really makes for a productive environment. And in so many places, I was just talking to one yesterday where productivity means quote unquote working. And what you're saying is the more you do that, the less actual productivity happens, right?
Well, and in particular, the neurological studies. Now, we now have enough evidence to say the more focused we are, the more repetitive tasks will get done, but the less engaged we'll be and the less innovative or adaptive we'll be. And now we're seeing the statistics come out repeatedly. The less you get what's called organizational citizenship behavior, where somebody does more than their job on their own volition. So what we're doing is losing, if you will, the magic of working with people that's fun and exciting. And sometimes it's as simple as changing up the stimulus.
In what way?
Like, well, if you've got a group of colleagues, maybe you make it legitimate to devote 15 minutes to talking about the latest movie they streamed, on Netflix or Amazon. Did they see one that was interesting? Or I remember decades ago, I used to take the incoming PhD students on a field trip for one of my 3-hour classes down to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I mean, it happens to be one of the few museums in the world where everybody's happy because everybody's kind of moving around. And um, and it was very interesting because it introduced, as some of us like to use music in our classes too, but we're sensory sentient beings introducing other topics, talking about a book you've read, or like I said, a movie or series you've been streaming. Those are interesting. They're more human. And it keeps us away from the kind of topic like politics that is inherently divisive and therefore threatening.
Yeah, interesting. There's a whole so many things here I want to explore with you. One, you mentioned earlier the different task networks, right? So
Right.
can you elaborate on that? Because I think that's really
Well,
important.
this is at the heart of the work that Tony Jack has been doing,
Yeah.
in which it built on some early work of Randy Buckner and others in kind of first published around 2005 and all that, is that we have a number of networks in the brain, thousands of them actually, but and the brain doesn't function by one part of the brain. It's always a network.
Right.
Uh, and two of the networks that are very relevant for most of our waking hours are the analytic network, technically called the task positive network, and what Tony calls the empathic network, technically the default mode. Bad name. I think I like Tony's names of analytic, empathic. But his argument is they're both reasoning, to go back to the attack on Descartes, they're both cognitive events, but they both have a lot of affect in them, but they function differently. And Tony started doing a set of studies. Now he published some of the first ones 8 years ago, 9 years ago, with larger sample size, more precise measurement, showing that these two networks have almost no overlap and suppress each other. They're antagonistic. So every time you do something philosophical, analytic, financial, IT, accounting, engineering, you focus, you're able to solve a problem, you can make a decision, but you've suppressed your openness to new ideas, to people, to finding out what's going on or staying in touch. Likewise, if you spend too much time in the empathic network, you get easily distracted, you don't get things done. Um, so we need both. Now, the interesting dilemma is these networks, most people toggle or cycle back and forth in unconscious speeds, thousandths of a second. We contend that the most effective managers, leaders, helpers, spouses, parents, partners, people you interact with, develop the facility to go back and forth with unconscious facility, speed, and also have a sense as to which network is needed more in particular moments. So the question is, how do we develop those? And the big example, we published an article a number of years ago on ethics training and leadership. So many people think training ethics is teaching people right and wrong, which is ridiculous. Almost everybody knows right and wrong. Psychopaths don't care, but they know the difference. Well, when you get into right and wrong, you're in analytic mode. So you're closing down from people. And it's like if we spend all of our time trying to increase diversity of thought and inclusiveness by telling people that they're bad, they're evil. What we do is threaten them, and we engage the analytic network, and people go into stress and they close down. What we should be doing to teach ethics is teach people more interpersonal skills and allow for not just diversity, but people talking with each other who are different. I mean, we can go over case after case after case where there's been some huge ethical lapse in an organization. In almost every case, the information was there, but people didn't listen to that person. So part of this is courses, and I think the more we start young, the better off we'll be. But certainly at collegiate and graduate levels, is moving in and out of knowledge acquisition with team projects, making sure that whatever people are doing, they have some concrete practice. So in the sciences and engineering, it's labs. In the social sciences, it's probably labs. In the humanities, it's studios or tutorials. But the idea is we make sure that however abstract and intellectual we're getting, we also have moments where we're being more interpersonal and allowing thoughts and feelings and valuing other people to come into play.
Get a balanced diet, so to speak, right?
That's right. And I'm not saying this just because I'm a Libra and according to one astrologer that it was actually quite good at what she did. 7 of my 9 planets, including Pluto, were in Libra on the hour I was born. So I do advocate for a balance of, stress and renewal.
And we'll be putting Richard's astrological chart on the show notes. So just in case you want to see for yourself. But that's really fascinating, right? And so a couple other things. One is that I think Case Western and the Drucker School are probably one of the few business schools on the planet that really put human beings at the center of the teaching process, right?
I agree.
David Cooperrider was on this show very recently, and one of the similarities I think between the two of you is this notion of the dream, right? Yes. Like we project forward into what is the reality we want to create.
Right.
It reminds me of one of my favorite studies that I have not forgotten in 30 years since graduate school, of something that Mihai Csikszentmihalyi did with one of his students, and which was a study of 60 men, I think 30 men, all of them came from impoverished backgrounds. 15 stayed impoverished, 15 went on to become world famous experts. And what distinguished the two groups was that the ones who changed their station in life could all point to a very specific book that they had read that gave them the idea, something that you said, that there was more than immediate reality. They could disconnect from their immediate reality, and that book gave them a vision for what reality could be. And because they could imagine that, they were able to
Right.
realize there could be something else, right?
Right.
And so, and it's
Nothing removes the life force from humanity more than making people hopeless.
mm,
I mean, I don't think it was just happenstance that Marty Seligman created positive psychology out of his early studies on hopelessness.
mm,
I mean, he was studying the worst part of it, the darkest part of it, and then had a series of epiphanies that led him to quite the opposite. And I think that's what you're capturing here is that what opens the door? I mean, we very often say in our coaching work, when you help people, I mean, we call liberation education at times, what you're trying to do by getting this kind of a conversation going, it's like having a flower open up, and all of a sudden you can smell the brilliance of the flower. You can see these amazing colors. And that's what it feels like inside when you tap into this. And I think you're right. I think that it tends to happen. I tend to focus more on the conversations with certain people in your life who have had those moments. But I think it can
mm,
be possible, if not reinforced, by something you read or even watched. But
right.
honestly, one piece of a study we did suggested that the conversation with another person stimulates more parts of this neurological network we're talking about than just reading about it.
Interesting. So that I don't. So I'm really tempted to veer off of this because that's really interesting. But there's something I want to follow up on. That was the is that this notion of the dream can to some seem so frivolous, right? It's like, okay, we're going to go off in unicorn and in rainbow land, right?
Right.
But it's it's really the heart of human capability
Yeah.
to be able to generate realities that are not
In
in front of us, right? I want
in
to say
in the
more
late in
about
the
that.
middle and late 90s, I remember over at Dively, our executive education center, running some of these leadership workshops and talking about the importance of vision. And I remember, because this happened a number of times, some of these top executives would say, wait a minute, if I talk to somebody that reports to me about their dream, suppose their dream isn't to work in my company. What do I do? I said, well, they're not working now.
Right. Mhm.
So that's the part of the risk. Now, and I'm not saying that when you get along the process, we very often have social responsibilities.
Right.
God help us if we don't feel that, we're back to the narcissism. Social responsibilities may include making sure that you've got a good health care plan, for your family. It could be making sure you're making enough money to address not just needs, but some wants and desires. And but all of these things happen in a context where you're either trudging through life, scared about everything, and barely making it through, which is a real hollow existence. Um, wasn't it T.S. Eliot, The Hollow Men? Or we will, on a regular basis, shift into this other mode. I call them the positive and negative emotional attractor. We need both. Again, this balance issue. But here, balance isn't equal amount of time because negative is so much more powerful. Not better, but powerful. We need more moments in the positive emotional attractor, more moments of renewal than moments of stress to keep ourselves revitalized or vitalized, to keep ourselves curious. And if you look at any work organization and see when does the person innovate, whether it's in customer service, responding to something that a customer does with their facial expression or offering a service in a different way, the number of innovations we need to do to fulfill our purpose are huge. We can't do that when we've got blinders on. We're forced into repetitive activities. And that doesn't involve learning.
So this is such a fascinating conversation. You had this idea, you just mentioned the negative emotional attractor and the positive emotional attractor,
Right.
and that kind of echoing the dark side of the force, that the negative emotional attractor is seemingly stronger, right? That its charge is bigger, right? And that we're oriented
Yes.
towards things that are potential threats. And so did I infer correctly that the move to make is that you have to have more positive moments or more positive kind of hits to balance out the relative strength of the
Yes.
survival orientation?
Yes. And as you know, because you've taught some of this work, Barb Fredrickson in studying teams shows you need about 3 times the number
Yeah.
of of positive events to the negative. John Gottman showed in Loving Stable Marriages a 5-to-1 ratio. I mean, we showed in coaching, it has to be at least 2 to 3 times the PEA moments to the NEA moments. Now, this becomes very important because there are people in the positive psychology movement who have drummed me out of the core because they say, I admit that negative has a role. Of course it does.
Yeah, absolutely, right?
You know, we are beings that require adaptation, and sometimes we get threatened.
Yeah.
So we have to. There is a usefulness to it, like waking up.
Yeah.
But again, if that's all there is, life becomes drudgery.
Yeah. Yeah.
And whether we talk about the opposite or the alternating experience as flourishing, or I call it thriving
Mm-hmm.
versus surviving, you know, those are the things that help literally inflate our sense of energy, our curiosity, our love, and our capacity for love. The other experiences are inevitable and necessary, but they deflate.
Yeah.
So what we need to do is get better at going back and forth, not and we have to do it for ourselves because we know neurologically we're infecting people around us in thousandths of a second with how we're feeling inside, not what we're showing on our faces, but how we're really feeling inside. And that means that if we're feeling excited about the joy of life, other people have a shot at it. If we're feeling, oh my God, this is work, that's why they call it work, everybody else will start to feel that way. So when we're in a leadership role, a management role, a helping role, physician, nurse, therapist, teacher, parent, we have to pay heed to both. And a part of the social responsibility of our roles is to focus on the other person, but we can't do it to the exclusion of keeping
Oneself.
ourselves vital and
Yeah.
revitalized.
And so the organization or the team experiences the consciousness of the leader. And so that's contagious, right? So
Yes.
it's a kind of social responsibility to keep oneself in a good
Right.
spot, so to speak, right? And so then that gets back to something else I wanted to explore. So just to reiterate, right? We have this negative emotional attractor and positive emotional attractor. We need more positive moments, right, to balance out our negative tendencies. I think about a leader who I know well. I know you're listening, right? Who wants his team to be more team-like, but he regularly shames and insults them. And so one day it'll get through. Hopefully you're listening to this. You know who you are. And so, but the other
I
thing
saw
about
that on Game of Thrones.
Going back to the coaching model, right? So we have the dream, the ability to disconnect from immediate reality, generate a vision that we can move forward to, right? Which is also
Yes.
part of the
Whether we're
appreciative
doing it
inquiry.
individually or in teams or in organizations or communities.
Yeah. And I'm kind of headed up to my third eye in deconstructive postmodernism. It seems like what we need to have is a reconstructive postmodernism of like, what's the world we want to create? What do we want to move toward?
Charles Taylor, the noted Canadian philosopher of recent years, um, took postmodernism to task
Mm.
when he was in a marvelous set of books in the 90s, when he said they're inherently very individualistic and therefore very narcissistic.
Mm.
And he said the idea of cultural relativism taken to the extreme, where whatever somebody wants to do is okay, is absolutely absurd because we're human beings. We have, his term was moral horizons of significance.
Mm.
So no matter what, you know, it's not a good thing to kill another person. You may have to, but it's not good. It's not good to take something from somebody that isn't yours. That's a moral horizon of a significance. So what happens if we don't honor that? We lose the ability to have a social fabric. And what we see with the relative chaos going on in some of our inner cities these days is horrendous. And it has, excuse me, it has nothing to do with social justice. It has to do with excessive self-centeredness and violating our responsibilities to each other.
That builds on something I wanted to say. So that the dream is enabled by relationship is what I hear. I mean,
Yes,
that's one of the themes of
yes,
this conversation.
yes.
And that part of the gift of the intentional change model in the coaching practice is that the coach acts as one of those support systems, right? So
Yeah.
say more about, well, the sense of being in a lot of the conversations I've had lately, and especially when the person is a female leader, right? The orientation has often been about looking at the larger context, and in a way, the language I'm kind of converging on is a leadership of weaving and reweaving.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
and that I'm thinking about Heather Dyer, who I spoke with a couple of episodes ago, you know, that she looks at what are the people's needs, what are the agency's needs, and we speak to those needs, and how do we help meet those needs? And that when people understand, okay, somebody cares about my needs and is willing to help me try to get them, I'm willing to play, I feel safe, and I'm willing to play ball. And the result is, like, the concrete result is that the accomplishments are unheard of or could be or
Right.
unimagined at the beginning, right?
Not that many years ago, before COVID, before the '08 to 11 Great Recession, not great good, but great big, um, a group did a survey of 1,800 MBA graduates 2 years later in Europe. MBAs are famous for, as you know from your MBA program, Jeremy, they're famous for leaving jobs quickly after they graduate. Even jobs they take when they graduate, they leave often. And they asked them what was the reason they chose to work for the company they now are working for 2 years later, and why they're staying. And salary and benefits was the seventh across the 1,800. And this came from a lot of countries in Europe. The first six were opportunities to do something interesting, opportunities to grow and develop, novelty, and all of these things that have to do with something more than a functional transaction. And that ends up being something that I think every organization has to understand today, because you are not going to keep people. You know, with 11 million jobs, if the Wall Street Journal was right last week, open in this country, and as the economy in many sectors keeps growing, those number of jobs openings are going to increase. And when you're talking about all of the jobs that involve interpersonal interaction or ingenuity or learning, all these things that is necessary, from retail store clerks to scientists, it's going to be the issue of retention and engagement. And I think people actually are fairly clear with us as to what they want, and in that case, need. which is sense of purpose, a chance to grow and develop, respect for what they're trying to do, and I allowing for the fact that we're not talking about, as McDonald's calls themselves, America's best first job, the minimal pay jobs, but for the professionals and executive ranks, we're talking about folks that it's not going to be the monetary issues. It's going to be the other. I was at a board meeting yesterday at a major, I don't want to say healthcare center, and they were talking about the phenomenal turnover of nurses that's happening. And they've got a really good climate. But what's happening is there's so many medical centers in this particular community that people are coming along and saying, and one of the top executives said sometimes they'll get entreated by another $1,000 a month and they'll change jobs. Now, we hope in a few years they'll come back. But I said later that although they may say that's why they went, I suspect that the money is merely an excuse. It sounds like a kind of rational argument, although it might be. But I think it's the issue of people want novelty.
Interesting. And that that's interesting. So where's the role of relationship in management, and how do you create cultures where people want to be? Peter Drucker said, treat your knowledge workers like volunteers because they could leave.
Yeah, right.
And it seems to me
they vote with their feet.
They vote with their feet, right? And that the pandemic has kind of put that on. Look, you alluded to it earlier, right? That they put it on
the job of a leader.
Burner, right?
Right, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. The job of a leader is to manage or inspire people who will manage or inspire people, who will manage or inspire people, who will manage and inspire people, who will actually do the work. So, of course, leadership and management is all about relationships because that's the only thing you have. Yes, you might have a budget. Yes, you might have a strategic plan, but do you really think people are driven in ways that we're talking about just because of those? No. Matter of fact, I think strategic planning, although useful for asset allocation, is horrible for motivating change because I think in more organizations, people swarm when they actually do infect or affect change. Okay, so if leadership and management is all about relationships, then you start saying, okay, what are the characteristics of the relationships? Well, in the 60s, everybody focused on clarity. Well, today, I think you hear a lot more people wondering why. And it's not that they're being adolescent or obstinate, it's that they want to understand purpose. And more people than ever want to know that we're not just, doing well, we're also doing good. So we're somehow contributing to society, we're somehow helping the environment, but at the minimum, we're not hurting it. And you start to overlay all of these things that, leadership and management is tough because you've got to handle a lot of things that are seemingly in opposition with each other, but that's the stew that you're trying to create. That's the recipe. And
it's
all people.
And why do you think there are only a few business schools in the country that emphasize that as
Go back to the two opposing domains, Tony Jack's idea. If most of the curriculum in a management or business school is accounting, okay, analytic network, empathic network. Let's look at the courses: accounting, finance, economics, statistics, supply chain. What are you competing with it over here? leadership, organizational behavior. And instead of teaching marketing in terms of market presence and understanding trends and things like that, more will do it in terms of analyze the 4 Ps. Look at strategy. Instead of teaching it creatively, a lot of people teach it through a formula. So I think management and business schools are creating the very forces that are leading to this preoccupation with the analytic network, which is shutting out
Right.
innovation and learning.
We're overtraining one set of muscles, right?
That's right.
Drucker,
And in fact, we're overtraining the set of muscles that are the easiest to develop and not paying attention to the ones that are a bit more elusive.
that are the harder ones, right? Yes. So you and I are similar, right? We have the
Okay.
hard skills and the harder skills, right?
Right. So here's the thing, because you asked the question about culture before.
Mm.
In chapter 8, we started a position that we're now spending a lot of time, we being Ellen and Van Osten and Melvin Smith and myself, is that we think every organization should make a commitment to create a culture of development that complements their culture of performance. We're not saying replaces it, because you have to perform, you need results. You know, your whole transaction with your resources is to produce certain results and have your capital stronger at the end. But if you don't have a culture of development, the human capital will not be.
And
You'll
cultural
be
development looks
spending
like what? Like what does that do?
um, having people feel like there are opportunities where they can shift
Mm-hmm.
roles. You know, the old notion of career pathing, temporary assignments, coaching, peer coaching in groups, not just the usual of training programs and things like that, but I think fundamentally being able to have conversations in which you're helping each other.
Mm. And, and that's where oftentimes the fun part is, right? So
Right, right.
yeah, yeah. So we could keep talking for hours because this is, to me, it's endlessly fascinating. The book you mentioned is called Helping People Change. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. Here it is.
Thank you.
And the coaching, also put a link to the coaching, both the research lab and the coaching core at Weatherhead, which is a really special place.
Yeah, the coaching services and the training programs, right?
Yeah. And so what I take away is that, I mean, there are a lot of takeaways, but this idea of the intentional change model is we have to be moving towards something. And okay, sorry, I have to ask this because it's something I think about a lot. Like so many people are just trying to get by, right? And I often ask people, what are the questions, that the questions your life is reflected by the questions you ask yourself. And a lot of times the question people ask themselves is, how do I just get by? And there's a lot more that's possible. Right?
That's a survival question.
Exactly.
And I am not in any way, shape, or form saying that is not a fundamental issue. I mean,
yeah.
Like I said, my parents are immigrants. They didn't leave their families and friends and home country because they were looking for some new experience. There was a feeling of desperation in the
Yeah.
30s.
Yeah.
And so I think there are times in which people are desperate and need to survive. They need to get by. But once you are in a relatively free society, so this is different in totalitarian states, and regardless of whatever you think about the current social trends or mores or systemic issues in countries like the United States and Canada and most countries of Europe and Australia, is that we have relatively free societies. And one of the things that means is that a person may need to get by, but if that's all they're going to do, they're condemning themselves to a minimal life. That my father gave up on his dream of going to college and doing something else to be a waiter. But he found himself at a particular restaurant where every one of the waiters came from a different country. They all had accents. They loved what they were doing. And it was one of the most elite supper clubs, kind of jazz clubs in New York City during its era. And, um, my father is one of those role models I always have of tremendous emotional intelligence, in part because everybody liked him. I can't say that about me. But he was really that way. And he was charming. And I'm not saying we didn't have fights. Of course we did. And he didn't, at times, punish me in ways that felt, even by current standards, probably abusive. But, it all worked out. But he loved what he did. But he also always knew that he was doing it and managing with my mother, our family, in a way to make sure that my sister and brother and I had a different chance, So I'm a professor at Case. My brother's a full professor at Bucknell. My sister was an accomplished teacher, elementary school teacher, and then ran a store for 20 years. Um, but it was looking ahead to not just the current moves, but what are they in service of? And I think that that's where the meaning comes in.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good place to put a post-it. And thank you so much. Thanks for listening. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the podcast. Give us a review and tell us your thoughts. The best thing you can do is share this with someone who would find it interesting and helpful. If you have an idea for other topics you'd like to explore, please let us know. Contact me at info@jeremyhunter.net. Thank you to the multi-talented Mr. Jason Beck for making the magic happen behind the scenes. And our music is the creation of Jeffrey with a G Munger. You can learn more about his work at kettleblackmusic.com.